So as promised, we will begin our journey through the Proverbs today. A couple of things. Several of you last week asked me about what could I make the bullet points that we covered last week available. I did print them out for you if you were looking for them. As you come in the front door, there's what do you call that thing, Kat? Thank you. That's the word. In unison, friends, credenza. It's in the front door as you come in. And I did put some copies of those on there. If you're looking for the points in the scripture sites from last week, they should be out there. If they get all scalped up before you get them, just let me know. I'll be glad to print you or email you a copy so you can have that. If you missed that, I guess you can go back and watch it online. It should be up now, christcentralchurch.org. And I think it was, what's the title of it? Stuck, Unstuck, I believe is the message title. If you want to go back and watch that, and then if you would like to sit down and chew through any points, please send an email to hello@christcentralchurch, and we'll get you on the calendar. I'll be glad to have a conversation with you. Before we begin to journey through Proverbs, I also need to mention two other things. Number one, anytime that we study books together, I always try to make an effort to break down the book for you so you can kind of read along, follow along, study along if you want. And I've done that again for the book of Proverbs. It's on the round little back table here inside the sanctuary, and also on the table back there. There are notebooks provided by one of your beloved in the congregation that they felt like if you want to take notes after last week or you want to take notes with anything this week, the notebooks and pens are back there. They're free. Pick one up, write your name on it, make whatever notes you would like from this series or any other. Take journals, help me. Where I lose you, write it down in your notes and send it to me. And I'll try to do better next time, and we'll keep getting better together as we continue to pursue what God has in store for us through His Word. So all that's on the back table back there. Rudy isn't guarding it. He's just sitting back there. And that's if you're looking for it. So I just want you to go along. So today, we're going to begin with the first little section of Proverbs. And I want to just kind of read it with you. So if you've got your Bible, it's Proverbs chapter 1. And whether your Bible's on your phone or in hand, and we're going to just kind of pick through. At the beginning today, we're just going to do a little bit of teaching, and then we're going to focus on one final verse in our time together before we celebrate communion. So the author, Solomon, begins this way. He says, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, in justice, in equality, in giving prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in their learning, and that the one who understands, let them obtain guidance to understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. For verse 7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools, they despise wisdom and instruction. Now, if I'm to be honest with you, the title of this particular series or study as we go through Proverbs, Foolproofing Your Life, the more I've studied in the Proverbs, the more I've come to the realization that most of the time in my life, I'm the fool that needs my life needs proofing over. And so we're going to walk through some of this stuff here today, and it's for things that you can't see in the English, and so you don't have to take my word for it, but I would appreciate it if you will. So here's the general purpose of the book, right? He begins it in verse 2. The general purpose of the book, if you're taking notes, is to know, or maybe your translation like mine says it this way, is to learn. That's the general purpose of the Proverbs, is so that you and I can learn. And then he goes on to extend some things that he wants for us to learn. He wants for us, Solomon, by the way, wants for us to learn wisdom and instruction. Now, in the Hebrew, you can't see it in the English, but in the Hebrew, wisdom, there's cognate words here in the Hebrew that what we're talking about. And it's not just he wants you to go to school and get a master's degree or a doctorate. It's not that necessary kind of learning that we're talking about. in the book of Proverbs. What he's talking about, there's two cognate words there together. He's talking about learning in wisdom. It's a word used for learning moral skills. So in other words, what Solomon is writing for us to learn about is learning the moral skills, the everyday practical skills to living a moral life. And then the word right beside it, in terms of knowledge or instruction, is also a word that kind of links together. And you got to do a little digging in the Hebrew to get here on this one. But what he's talking about in instructions, he's talking about learning moral principles. So in the very beginning, what Solomon writes in the whole proverb isn't a collection of pithy sayings or things that we can print on the wall. He's talking about learning, instructing others in the way that leads to everyday practical moral living, moral skill, and learning the moral principles. And if you read down to verse 7, learning the moral principles of God. And so that's where we start. It's the overarching big general purpose of the book. And then this is how he kind of looks at us doing that. So he looks at, we learn by way of, again, instruction. And if you're reading it in some translations, which mine didn't say that, but it's one that in another translation, it talks about discerning. And so this is kind of the secondary purpose of the book that we are focused on. Is Solomon is writing to everyone in all ages, but basically about learning how to discern the difference between what is moral and what is not, about right living and wrong living, if that's the way you want to use the word. So this is where he's kind of brought us to. I want to pick on just a couple other things, and then we're going to move down and we're going to spend the rest of our time in verse 7. Number one, I do want to pick on this particular fact that Solomon saw fit. And those of you who've been Bible students or readers or around the church for a while, you know about Solomon, right? Supposedly the wisest cat in the whole world. So wise, though, and I would argue, not so wise that he had 1,000 wives. I have a hard time keeping myself happy. Right? So I don't know how smart he was, but either way, he's supposedly the wisest guy in the whole world, and at some point along in his journey, he decided that everything he learned needed to be taught to somebody else. And if you read down through these words here, friends, pay attention real closely. If you'll pay attention to the words, he decided that it's open to everybody. So in the Hebrew world, ladies, I don't want you to get left out, because lots of times in English translation, it's all male pronouns that gets used. But in Hebrew world, a woman was allowed and seen as having wisdom. And so I'm going to spin this out just a little bit and say that Solomon, while it may appear, is only writing to men from a man's perspective. That probably isn't the case. What Solomon is also including you ladies in the fact that wisdom is something that's not only open to you, but probably, as he learned from his marital life, probably you ladies are probably smarter than, well, the wisest guy in the history of the world. And that this instruction continues to be open to you just as much as it does to any human man on the earth. That's one thing. Secondly, I don't want you to miss this fact, that Solomon undertook to write the book. Young people, listen clearly to me. And we're going to cover this one next week. Don't miss. Bring your friends, young people, because it's all basically for you next week. He undertook to write the book for those of you who were younger, because if he I think you'll give me permission to say it this way, because he doesn't want you to end up like him. How do you end up being the wisest guy in the whole world and blow it? So when he's talking about instruction, about learning in the beginning of this book, about learning moral skill and moral principles, he's not writing from the perspective of the high and lofty ivory tower, in my opinion. He is writing after the fact, on the other side of the complexity and calamity of his life that came crashing down to the ground, and he's writing backwards to say, you know what, I've learned a thing or two in this old life, and if I could do anything with it, I would like to impart that wisdom and skill and knowledge to some of you younger folks who are coming along behind me. Now, those of you who are here that wouldn't fall into the younger folks category, look at it also as writing to you, right? Is that anyone in this, what he's trying to teach us, is that anyone that can hear or read the teaching is available to learn how to live morally, everyday practical skills, and moral principles. Every single one of us is open to do that. And for those of you who aren't necessarily as young as you once were, I leave that up to you to decide. Look at what it says in verse 5. Let the wise also hear and gain in learning and discerning, acquiring skills to understand a proverb, a figure, a word of the wise, and their riddles. In other words, for all of you, no matter what age you are, what Solomon is suggesting is the words that he's writing can continue to pay dividends in your life if you apply them. In other words, let me say it in Andrew contemporary English, you're never too old to learn. Now, I know we live by the contemporary language that says you can't teach an old dog new tricks. What I've learned is you just can't teach a stubborn dog new tricks. And what Solomon says is that no matter how old you are, no matter how long you've been following, and let's just put it into scriptural terms, no matter how long you've been following this Jesus character, there's so much more to God to learn now than it was when you started, that there's no way you have got to the point in your spiritual journey that you can pop the hatch and sail into the harbor and go, ta-da, I've made it. There's more to Jesus to know now than there was when you started. And Solomon's suggesting to us that there's always this lifelong learning that's available to all of us, if you'll have it. Now, you just thought these were opening verses. Solomon's peeled back and just said, here we go, sports fans. It can be tough. And so those are just a few things on the front. And I won't spoil it for you next week, but sometimes conventional wisdom comes in the form of a parable or a proverb, and it gets really hard for us who aren't as far along as some of the others of you to understand what you mean when you say certain things and do. And so what Solomon is also encouraging us is that throughout the course of his writing, learning moral skills and moral principles, that we'll be able to discern the meaning under the words people use in life. And I don't know about you, but there's been plenty of times in my life I wished I would have caught what was actually being said, because the words that were being said wasn't actually what was being said. Solomon suggests that learning moral skills and principles can teach you and I how to see the message under the message on the surface, so that we maybe don't end up like him. And so that's some of what we're going to spend the next few weeks dipping in and out, lacing through the Proverbs. And today, we're going to land and focus on this last little verse. This is verse 7. We're going to try not to spend too much time on it, but we're going to spend some time on it, because every conversation I've had this week, and maybe your week's been like mine, every conversation I've had this week has somehow included, either expressly or implied, fear. Every conversation I've had this week, almost universally. Sorry. For example, a buddy of mine called me Wednesday and says, well, what are you doing? I said, I'm just working. What are you doing? He says, well, I was thinking about the fact that you and I are now going to have to work until we're 85 years old. I said, you're doing what? Says, yeah, did you know that you're going to have to work till you're 85 years old now? I dared not ask where the information came from because it wasn't but just a second when he took a breath. He said, have you seen what the stock market's doing? Said, no, I'm working. And then he proceeded to tell me about all the stuff that was going on, and then Thursday it got worse, and Friday it gets worse again. And so implicitly in the conversation, it was just about this fear of, oh no, what am I going to have to do? And I realized about Friday afternoon that it was probably more people in my sphere of influence that felt that way than him. Now, maybe some of you are here, and that was a real concern for you today, and I think that we're going to try to peel out in verse 7 what Solomon's talking about this idea of, like, what place does fear have in our life? No, it's not to mention the expressed fear that drives the financial concern fears that we have. I was having another conversation on Thursday with my father-in-law who said, you won't believe how many masks I sold today. I said, what are you talking about? He said, I sold more face masks today than I sold last year. And I said, why? He said, because the pharmacy's out and people come to the paint store to buy the masks to wear out in public. And so about Friday afternoon, I recognized that this whole idea of a silent, invisible, dangerous, potentially life-threatening virus, it really has churned up an excessive amount of fear amongst people. And it seemed to me that it was a timely word from God that we would be messing around with the emphasis of the day that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And so we're going to pull apart and look at this whole idea this morning just for a little bit about really, and I don't know what you make out of all the concerns right now about this virus that's going around. All the reading I can do says basically one thing: we don't know too much about it. Which really is part of our problem, right? Is when we don't know too much. The absence of information. There's always people who will supply their own facts. We just happen to call that the media. And so today we're in this, let's just press on this a little bit, and let's just kind of put out in the open, and maybe you're not concerned about all this, and maybe you don't know anybody who's concerned about it, and maybe you're sitting back trying to think about why in the world would anybody that's supposed to be a Bible believer waste my time talking about something like some virus that might be around. And I'm not talking about the virus, I'm talking about the irrational fear of when we leave fear unarrested or unchecked, the things that happen from fear. And this virus is just the thing that drives our conversation today as it relates to our time in Proverbs, right? And so I started thinking about, and you think with me here, and you know how my thinking goes sometimes. It's sometimes like Tin Lizzie cars. You go over here and you hit this rail, and we come back and we hit this rail. And so you'll just be patient with me, I hope. And if you don't, it's okay. There's notebooks in the back. There's coffee out front. And you just do what you got to do. But I started thinking about this whole idea of what do we do with the fact that, you might not be alive to hear the end of this sentence that I'm about to say. Have you ever really thought about that? The short answer is no, because that's weird, and I don't like feeling that way, and I'm not going to think about it very much. Well, today we're going to invest some time in that, because the reality is that, like, we don't, there's all kinds of things that exist that could snuff our lives out in an instant that we aren't concerned with at all. I'll give you an example. Nuclear weapons. Anybody spend much time thinking about how nuclear weapons could just annihilate everybody in the span of about 45 seconds? You spend any time this week thinking about that? Nope. I mean, if you thought about who was in control of those things, then you might spend some time thinking about it and being nervous, but that's a whole nother conversation. Either way, I started thinking about what things really drive this idea of fear in our lives, and I think it's three little kings, if you will. You'll allow my language this morning. Three little kings that really drive fear in life. If you're jotting them down, and you tell me if you think I'm wrong, right? And I think you've seen them before, and I think you're familiar with these three little kings, and I think that if you thought about it, you've probably even sang about them. We three kings from Orient are. I would sing it to you, but singing in the key of snot doesn't seem very attractive. And besides, if I threaten to sing to you, it'll be the greatest threat I ever make against you. But I think you're already aware of who these kings are. And you just didn't know that this was who they were. And so here's the first little king I think drives fear in mine and your life if we leave it unchecked and unarrested. The first little king that drives fear in our life is the king of security. The king of security, and the king of security kind of has this thing, right? It propels all of us to want to make sure that we stay safe, and rightfully so, because if the king of security didn't exist, there would be no Southerners. And you'll know why. Hey, y'all, watch this. We'd have annihilated ourselves a long time ago. But the king of security does have a proper place, but left unarrested or unchecked, it can do some real damage. So the king of security helps and rightly wants us to live, be alive. The king of security wants us to stay safe physically, and that translates into other parts of security in our life too, doesn't it? The king of security gets us focused on our financial security. The little king of security gets us focused on job security or material security or secure in our health or secure in our relationships. Before you know it, the king of security he rules and reigns all over the place, and he's arguably, and I'll put him in he language, ladies, you can put him in she language or her in she language if you want. The king of security is arguably the most powerful of the little kings in mine and your life. Arguably. It puts fences around your yard. It puts security systems on your lawnmower. The king of security, the little king of security, left unchecked, does a whole host of things in our life. And I think you've seen them before, but you just didn't know that you see them. Here's the second little king that I think drives fear in our life. And I'm going to talk about why it drives fear in a minute. The second little king that drives fear in our life is the cousin of little king security. And it's the cousin king here is the little king of, you ready? Approval. The little king of approval. And here's how the little king of approval works, right? Is she figures that if people like me, they won't try to kill me. This is how they're related. That's right, it's related to physical safety. And you think, well, I'm not worried about anybody killing me. Well, but the little king of approval seeks in all things to be liked, to be loved, to be valued, to be wanted, to be appreciated, to be respected, to be belong to something, to be a part of something bigger than themselves. Not that that's a wrong thing inherently, but left unchecked and unarrested, the little king of approval will flip around a natural desire and utilize it to scare us. The final little king here that If the king of security doesn't gain a foothold and the king of approval doesn't gain foothold, this little one will always gain a foothold. This is the little king of control. The little king of control will always find a way to gain a foothold if we leave it unchecked. And so the little king of control starts to take over and do these things in life, and it tries to make sure that life goes the way that I want it to go in all things. And when life don't go the way I want it to go, what does the little king of control do? It musters up the army to make sure things go the way I want it to go, right? And so by default, control becomes this thing that the little king takes over, and it has control of myself and control of other people and control of circumstances. Hey, the little king of control on his best day will even try to control God. And everything else. You say, well, what in the world does these little kings you're talking about have anything to do with this idea of fear? Well, here's how it has to do. Because the only weapon of a tyrant is fear. The only weapon of a little tyrant king is fear. The only way to keep you focused on this idea of safety is to scare you with it. The only way to keep you focused on approval is to scare you with its absence. The only way to keep you focused on this notion of control is to threaten to take it from you. And now, let me say, this is how it relates to fear, and it relates to this notion of things we're dealing with in the public right now. And particularly this virus, as I started out. Is it really that we're concerned about an invisible killer, or is it really that we're worried about safety? Is safety the little king that's driving the concern, or is it something else? Is the fact that we can't control who and where it goes and what might happen with it, isn't that really the thing that causes the consternation in our life? Heck, even beyond the potential threat of a pandemic virus, isn't that really the reason that we focus on control of anything? Isn't that really why any fear comes about in our life? Is because fear is the only weapon of the tyrannical little king, and it is the evidence, friends, that they rule somewhere in our life. As we started out a minute ago, if you think about it, danger is everywhere, right? And if you don't believe that, all you need to do is drive from here to Birmingham. All you need to do is get between some dog and its owner down at the pet shop. Like there's hundreds of ways that, friends, right now, I mean, the danger is rampant. And if we let the little kings take over, then all of a sudden we become arrested and unchecked. We become paralyzed in our lives. And so what Solomon's suggesting to us is that there is such thing as a rational and helpful fear, but there's also the presence of an irrational and unaddressed fear that causes us to worship some other king in our life. And so the things that we deal with in the world only help us to kind of underscore and ask the question, what king is it that we worship? I told you earlier that these little kings are ones that you had already met before, and we're about to get to that in just a second. But if you think about it, these little kings aren't motivated by love for you or love of you. Safety, approval, and control, they do not love you. Not at all. Why? Here's how I know why. Because if they loved you, they wouldn't threaten you with the very thing that they are, or its absence. They don't love you at all. In fact, they only seek to lord their power over you. And at the end of the day, here's what they really do. They take the risks of everyday living and they attempt to translate it into the language of fear to keep you and I obedient to things other than the thing or person that we should be obedient to. And let me underscore once again, they do not love you. They do not love you at all. And so I wondered this week privately, and you helped me work on this a little bit, about this notion of fear. I wondered why anybody, any of us, including myself, would worship kings that just don't love them. I wondered that privately and now aloud, and maybe you can roll it around with me. But there's still this idea of, I said that you've met these little kings before, because honestly, I don't think they love you and I don't think they care about us at all. But you have met them. And my other question that I had was, I wonder why anybody would worship an inferior king. See, I think you've met them before. I think you met them in Matthew chapter 2, right? In Matthew chapter 2, you're familiar with when Jesus was born, the wise men come, and we talk about the wise men came and they gave their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And nobody agrees with me on this. And as I say, you take it for what it's worth, but I think you've met them. I think you met them in Jesus' birth story. I think you just didn't know their names. And so here's the argument I want to make to you. Why would you worship a king that came to pay homage to the King of Kings? Why, when the King of Control came and gave his gift of gold to the King of Kings, why would you continue to worship a king that said out loud for all time that he or she was inferior to some other king? Why would you do that? Why would you worship a king that paid homage to the King of Kings and bowed at his feet and said that security was something that he could not maintain? Why would you worship at the feet of something? Why would you be afraid of losing something that the little king gave over to the King of Kings and said, here's my gift. You're worthy, not me. In other words, the very thing they seek to wield, they've laid at the feet of the one true king. And so why would anybody be afraid? Why would you be afraid? Why would you be afraid of not being able to keep security, control, or approval when those things have suggested and said, perhaps, if you follow my argumentation, said out loud that they couldn't keep it themselves? It seems kind of funny to me. But here's the thing I just want you to consider a little bit further. If you'll go along with me here, is this idea of fear, of losing security or approval or control, and the way that the world has threatens us or convinces us or sometimes we allow ourselves to be convinced or go back to worshiping an inferior king. Why would you do that? And why would you let the circumstances, the chaos of the world out there cause problems for you in here? Why would you let the chaos of the world or the problems out there create chaos for your world in here? I know that gets a little bit tricky and tough to follow as it relates to fear. But here's the reason we're talking about it inside the local church, right? Is that for everybody who gave their life to Jesus, at some point along the way, you don't worship a king that has bowed down and paid homage to anybody. You don't worship a king that has been threatened or is threatened or trades or deals in fear. You and I worship a king that hasn't given his life away or hasn't kept his life but chose to give his life away for you and I. To give his life away that you and I might be restored to life. Who has actually given his life away that he might take it up again and get you promise that there is a life beyond this life that we live right now. And what's that have to do with fear? I only remind you of Paul's words, friends, as we live in a world that seems to trade in the world where little kings rule and reign. I only remind you of Paul's words from Romans 8. For you have not received, all of us who have given our lives to Jesus, you have not received a spirit of slavery which leads again to fear. How about just saying that with me? You have not received a spirit of slavery that leads to fear. You are no longer a slave to any of the three little kings that lord that over you, if you've given yourself to Jesus. So no one can threaten to take anything away from you because they can't threaten you with fear. No fear of disease or financial security or nothing. You have not been given a spirit of slavery that leads to fear, but you have received, this one's particularly poignant right now at our house, you have received the spirit of adoption. You, friends, you've been adopted not into the family of the three little kings that have no power. You've been adopted into the family of God. And you can cry when you have concern, legitimate concern too. Abba, Father, that spirit bears testimony with your spirit that you are a child of God, that there is no power of man nor scheme of hell that can keep you away from the protection of the great God of the universe. Nowhere, no way, no how. And so, turn the TV off. Focus in on the fact that the God of all creation says that you are safe eternally for those who have been clothed with Christ, who trust Christ, who live and walk in his steps as best they can, day in and day out. Nothing can separate us from the great love of God. And let me circle right back and say to you, but that doesn't mean that the little kings aren't going to keep trying to threaten you with fear that comes so easily in this world. And my final exhortation to you around this idea of fear this morning is don't be like Esau. Do not be like Esau. Because it's on us as believers, as redeemed sons and daughters, to be in the workplace, to be in the marketplace, to be in the world, and to be a bold witness for, you know what? Something's going to get me anyway, but Jesus has already got me. When people have to take off work early or they lay out of work, and you'll get mad because they lay out of work, won't you? I guess I'm the only one that finds that remotely funny. Okay. Now just checking that you're following with me. So, but when they do that and the little king wells up and you can't think of all of a sudden it's this approval and this security and it's this idea of control, remind the little king that they're inferior and they don't rule in your life anymore, that Jesus rules in your life. Period. And that you're not going to be like Esau was when Jesus grafted us into the family of God. We became heirs with him. And we're not going to give our birthright away because of fear. We're not giving it away. You remember what Esau did, right? Because Esau's right now desires, just like mine and your right now desire to succumb to fear, might be. Esau's right now desire, he came to his brother and said, hey, you're making some stew and I'm starving to death. How about giving me a little of it? And those of you who knew his trickster brother named Jacob, what does Jacob say? I'll give you some. But first sell me that birthright of yours. You're entitled to everything that my daddy has, everything that's good, everything, all his wealth, all his possessions, you're entitled to it. And if you want some of what I got, you got to sell me what is rightfully yours, friends. And the story of Esau's family, of his lineage, is he chose to fall victim to the right now and not hang on to what was for the good of his entire life. Do not trade your birthright as sons and daughters of God for the fear of something that you couldn't control, even if you could see it coming. Don't give away the hope that you have in the gospel and the hope that you have in Jesus just because the news folks want us to be panicked and worried about something that we can't affect or influence right now and that nobody really has a good handle on anyway. Don't give away your birthright as a proclaimer and herald of hope because some little king has got a foothold in your life and is trying to take over once again. Don't trade your birthright. Because there's plenty of people, 3 little kings, in fact, that would have you to trade it. But you've been bought at a price. And that price came with one instruction. And this is the only fear as it relates to God that's appropriate. Because what Solomon's writing for us today is this particular thing. That the beginning of knowledge is fear of the Lord. And what he writes about throughout the course of this book in terms of moral instruction and in terms of moral principles is that healthy fear as it relates to the good God of all creation is equal to obedience to what he asks you to do. He doesn't threaten to take anything away from us. He doesn't try to scare us into doing the right thing. He invites us to continue to follow him, to submit ourselves to him, and to learn to live in the way that leads to life. And that life is the life that he restored when you gave your life to Jesus. Let you get caught up on that. And there's a whole raft of questions that we could investigate this morning. We could investigate Pharaoh's question. Who is this Lord that I should heed his voice? Who is our Lord? And what does it mean to have a healthy fear for our Lord? Friends, this morning, the Lord of the church and the Lord of all creation extends to us the opportunity to come into his presence. For when we celebrate Eucharist together, that's exactly what he invites us to. He invites us to contemplate whether this is a God that we should hold back and not come to because of something in our life, or whether he's a God of awe and reverence who doesn't threaten us, but invites every shortcoming and every thing that so easily entangles us. He invites us to bring it with him, bring it to him, so that we might give to him our fear, our attachment to security, our need for approval, and that we might find that his Spirit gives us all things, all those things, when we simply give ourselves to Him. So this morning, as we prepare to celebrate the Eucharist, friends, and I invite those of you who are serving to come on down. As we prepare to celebrate the Eucharist this morning, friends,